straw proposal. It was not this legislative proposal. And so we testified again. And that testimony actually is digging deeply into the DPS website, which has an awful lot of stuff in it, including quite imprecise explanations of what the existing green code is, by the way. In any case, we have not formally observed what is in the content of the proposal, except we've all read it. We simply have not made a formal presentation because communications went dark after Labor Day last year, and we hadn't heard back from DPS, and my folks got a little discouraged. And so energizing them for this event, me make it clear that there are many more qualified than I to comment on these codes and their implications, including the gentleman on my immediate right. The point here is that we are basically believe that the proposal for adoption of the IgCC is a reasonable one. It takes a limited number of jurisdictional requirements. Remember, it's customized in two ways. The first is that there are jurisdictional requirements which can be instituted by the county in a number of different ways. There are only two. One is the energy measurement. Everybody invents their own energy measurement. And the IgCC has a metric called what is it, Mark? ZEPI, like the clown. Zero Energy Performance Index. Sorry, dropped it. And it is very good because it takes into account source energy as well as the energy you measure at the meter. Remember that if you measure the energy of a building uses at the meter, you're leaving out the carbon that was produced by the generation to make that energy in the first place. The IGC takes care of that, and that's a very positive thing. And then a great many, once those electives are selected, as I say, there are only two, then there are a whole lot of other requirements which are made into project electives for the applicant. So I think the short answer here is that we're enthusiastic about this. I did not expect to hear this morning a continuing effort to adopt this proposal, the proposed adoption. I think that in general our group is positive about it and will support it, and we're certainly eager to continue participating in the process of its adoption because it deserves, frankly, broader ventilation than it's achieved up until now. We're eager to help do that and organize it, and we welcome the possibility of having this code. I think the great benefit of it is that it will make our green code much more clear than it is now. And by the way, LEED is not meant to be a building code. It never was. It's not now. And version 4 is a highly questionable document. I've had people who know much more than I tell me that it may in fact never come into action. It's now been postponed to mid-2016 as it's perfectly reasonable to move away from it. We would, however, suggest that LEED be available as an for a year or two during a transition recommendation, but we welcome the ability to participate, both this morning, of course, and over the past years, and look forward to helping DPS bring energy policy in this county to a rational condition.
Well, I appreciate that very much, Mr. Bennett. Thank you. So, Mrs. Jones, I think you are getting the message, which is that this is not something that the County Council would like to see neglected or buried or delayed. This has been historically a very high priority for the entire council. I'm glad that we have a somewhat more detailed plan, although not a specific plan, for when the code will actually come before us. I have a number of questions, but I know that, as presiding officer, it's my practice to yield to all other council members before I get to my questions, and I'll call first on you, Mrs. Jones. I know that you'd like to respond to some of the things that Mr. Sheveiko and Mr. Bennett raised. So you have the floor, and then I will recognize council members for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Leventhal. I actually wanted just to make two clarifications, or three, actually. First of all, the department is also very committed to this code. I think, though, that it is important to understand we've never abandoned working on it. There are things that have been done sequentially. What occurred a year ago, basically, were work sessions, not hearings, There were work sessions taking each code chapter, discussing each code chapter, and then reviewing all of the input from that in order to come up with the what we intend to promulgate, which is what Mr. Bennett was referring to. Once we came up with what we intended to promulgate, then the work began on getting a fiscal impact analysis and economic impact analysis. The reason why, and when we saw what the economic impact was, that took us back, and we said, well, wait a second, let's understand, because we hear, even with sort of nominal fees, or not nominal, but even with fees that are much, much smaller, every time we do anything, and even with the Executive Regulation 4-15, you hear about what the cost impact is upon the industry. And we want to be a leader, but we also don't want to be driving people away. And so when a code comes out as a national code that achieves a certain level of compliance, that puts us on a level playing field. And that's what the IECC will do for the energy piece of what we've discussed. I think it will help level the playing field, and we can drive these other things forward. And so that also has been a piece of the thinking and the discussion as we move forward, and we're going to be able to, again, as I said, update the impact statements and come up with something that we can then move forward and all be proud of. But I just wanted to make clear that that was part of the thinking. And just as we weigh in not upsetting the ability to process applications efficiently, we also have to make certain that we are not putting ourselves in a way that is not competitive in the region. And I do agree, I think these will be better buildings for it, and we do want to see them happen. And I think we're now in a place with the new code, the IECC and the IgCC when it comes over, that we will be able to be very, very proud of what we're doing.
If either Mr. Cheveko or Mr. Bennett want to respond to that, it's in order. And if not, I'll call on the chairman of the T&E committee, Mr. Berliner, followed by the chair of the Fed committee, Ms. Florine. Mr. Berliner?
Thank you, Council President. Thank you for scheduling this. I want to commend Ms. Schwartz-Jones. I think she is truly very committed to this and grateful for that commitment. Mr. Cheveko, I appreciate your observations. I have generally focused on the energy piece and appreciate your observations with respect to actually what's important about this particular code is its broader reach and its sustainability components, and I think that's what compels Ms. Schwartz-Jones in our conversations with respect to this. So I don't think you need to be convincing here. I do think the payback obviously is driven by the energy piece, and so when the IECC ratchets up the payback period in comparison to the new IgCC will be could be a little more challenging, and so I think that that's part of what drives some of the cost numbers. But what I was grateful for Mr. Bennett, and I also think Ms. Schwartz-Jones also observed, is that the details of this are pretty important, and that there's great latitude within the IgCC. So it depends on what form of the IgCC you ultimately decide to go forward with. Have you rethought the form of the IgCC in light of the new IECC and the feedback you're getting, or are you pretty committed to that which you had previously set forth with respect to?
We've not explored whether to increase the performance level over the IECC at this point. We did have a meeting. We actually reached out to Mr. Cheveko, and we discussed with him the options and his view on that, and we are open to addressing that as well. So there may be some changes that when we do send it over, there may be more options that would be required going forward. So I think that, and actually we certainly will talk to Mr. Bennett further. We've spoken with him in the past. I know that Mr. Nauman has worked quite closely with him. So the simple answer is no, we haven't looked at it from the energy piece. We can certainly explore that, but I think that we want to make sure, ultimately I don't want to lose the good for the perfect. And I think we'd like to get something over. So,
well, that as the Council President observed, we had put in legislation to ratchet up the LEED approach, to go every building would be a silver LEED. And at that point in time, we got pushback because people said, actually, we're sort of done with LEED on a certain level. That LEED was a great introduction into this sphere, if you will. And now it's sort of outlived its usefulness on a certain level, and that people are much more comfortable going to a code-based system, and one that's not so expensive to get certified, and one that you know going in fact, meets the objectives because you can measure it going in as opposed to 6 months later with LEED, decide whether or not it actually is compliant. So for many, many reasons, people have said to themselves, it's time to get to the next generation, if you will, of codes, and the IgCC has emerged as the consensus candidate, assuming we can get it right. So I appreciate that this is work that requires some amount of thought, and I get that a great deal of thought is going into it. Thank you.
Mr. Bennett, you had a remark?
Yes, please. Councilmember Berliner held a meeting in his office, it must have been nearly a year ago, and I credit him with asking the question which no one could answer, which is, can you explain to me how the codes deal with carbon? And the answer is no one can. As I tell my students, every one of these rating systems or codes is a business model, and business is made with complexity, and these codes are enormously complex. These are overlay codes, and so the coordination among them becomes a really critical issue. Take, for example, the IECC. The biggest change in energy performance in the IECC came between 2009 and 2012, and there's heartburn in the body of every builder in Montgomery County, including ourselves, who build very small things, over complying with the IECC 2012. The improvement for 2015 in the IECC, as rated by DOE, is only about 1%, but it was 15% or 12%, as you quoted. Some quote even 30% improvement between 2009 and 2012. So that code alone is making enormous impact on carbon emissions. Now, the rest of the aspects of sustainability, which we certainly associate ourselves with, and of course the American Institute of Architects is one of the sponsors of the IgCC, surprisingly. Actually, not surprisingly, but gratifyingly. So there is an interest here, I have to confess to. But the point is, these are changeable codes, they're complex codes, but they certainly, what I've heard this morning from the Department of Permitting Services is not only a step, it's many steps in the right direction. If we can get this thing started, then of course the code will be amended on the normal cycle. 2015 IgCC is not available until the end of this month, so it's simply not there. So adopt 2012, and then we can change it and adopt newer versions as they come along. I think that's the way to go. And speaking, by the way, to the question of LEED versus codes. LEED is a rating system. It's not a code. If I have any quarrel with the IGC at all, it's too much like LEED. There are too many choices. But it is what it is, and I think the ability for those choices makes it more palatable for those people who are most pained by its implementation.
Mr. Berliner, you yield. Ms. Florine.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Obviously, a lot of work has gone into this, and we'll continue to keep a close eye on it. We've been dealing with this for a long time. Here's my question, or suggestion. Ms. Schwartz-Jones, you were alluding earlier to the reality that you have in terms of dealing with different codes, different agencies with responsibilities and the like. Would it be worth giving some thought to what we might do legislatively to eliminate some of this concern about overlapping responsibilities? I know that's always been one of the challenges in terms of what park and planning does and what DPS does and who does what and how it all comes out at the end is really what this conversation is about. But you have to deal with the regulatory reality of the world that we've created. I guess I'd just like to suggest that you give some thought. Could we make it easier for this to be done by shifting responsibilities?
Perhaps.
I know that's kind of a scary and terrifying idea.
Well,
but why not? At least put it on the table. If the whole issue is coordination of site development with building development, and there are, obviously different points of contact, and how I appreciate how complex this all is. And we make it complex ourselves by creating